achieved.
Welcome back to Kamikaze Overdrive MMA Predictions, and at this point in time, who else did you expect it to be? As always, it is me, Scott Johnson, breaking the fight down for you, and on this episode of the show, we're taking a look at the upcoming UFC 154 event, which will take place on November 17th, 2012 from the Bell Center in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. In the main event, we have the return of the reigning UFC welterweight champion, George "Rush" St-Pierre, puts his title on the line against potentially his most dangerous challenger ever, the interim champion, Carlos Condit. I'll be breaking down the 5 main card predictions on the show, and there are 8 preliminary matchups. All 8 preliminary fights will be broken down and predictions given over at kamikazeoverdrive.net throughout the fight week, so please head over there and check them out. Also, my prediction team will be giving their predictions at the website, so please check them out as well. The bet packs will be available for $10. One lucky purchaser of the bet pack will win a prize from heartandglory.com, their website, one of their fantastic MMA t-shirts. So you buy, your name goes to a draw, and potentially you win. And on top of that, we're hoping you take home some money. Now, I'm coming off of not a bad UFC on Fuel TV 6 event where I went 6-3 overall. 2 of my 3 losses were by split decision. Definitely the Gomi Danzig one was a little bit questionable. And of course, the big upset win by Kung Lee over Rich Franklin. You can check out all of my thoughts on that event on the post-fight breakdown that I posted on the website as well. Now, these bet packs, I'm hopefully going to be pounding some money home. I had a couple winning parlays. 3 of my 5 confidence picks hit at UFC on Fuel TV 6. 3 of my value picks hit, including my number 1, which was John Lineker. I also had 3 prop bets hit, and I'm really looking forward to this. There are a ton of betting options with 13 fights available, so I definitely look forward to making some serious cash for you guys. And before I get into my first prediction, as always, I'd like to thank my sponsors, MMABettingOdds.com, HeartandGlory.com, CouchFighter.co, MMACrips.com. The guys over the Adrenaline Training Center, a couple of them will be fighting on this card. And that's enough from me. It's time to get into my first prediction of the evening. The first of our 5 main card predictions takes place in the UFC Featherweight division as 20-11-0 Mark the Machine Hominick takes on 12-3-0 the Scarecrow Pablo Garza. Hominick right now has hit a bit of a skid in his career. He's dropped 3 in a row, but you look at the guys he's dropped them to against Jose Aldo, the champion, against one of the top contenders in the division, Chen Sung Jung, and a very interesting matchup against Eddie Yagin, where basically Hominick won the fight bell to bell, with the exception of getting knocked down a couple of times, which basically gave Yagin the rounds because they were the most significant aspect, even though I think Hominick had a better overall performance. Pablo Garza, on the other hand, same thing. He found himself climbing up the divisional ranks, and then a submission loss to Dustin Poirier on the first UFC on Fox event, and then a dominant decision loss against Dennis Bermudez, and it knocked him right back down. Now, looking at these two guys, the first thing that stands out to me is the physical disparities. Pablo Garza is a gigantically tall featherweight, coming in at 6'1", so he's going to have a 5-inch reach advantage on Mark Hominick, and he's also going to have a 5-inch height advantage as well. So 5 and 5. So those are some big advantages there, and Hominick's going to need to get inside and find a way to land on Garza. Garza's best offensive weapons are his kicks, at least on the feet, and some knees, and he'll utilize them well. Hominick, on the other hand, more of a pure boxer. He has excellent head movement, footwork, and he gets inside and lands with regularity. Looking at their win-loss totals, Garza, biggest number of wins, 7 wins by submission. He does have 2 wins by knockout, and he had that impressive KO flying knee against Fredson Pajau in his UFC debut, which was very impressive. He also has this flying triangle choking at Yves Jabouin, which was equally impressive. And those are things Hominick's going to have to watch out for, is those limbs coming at him from all angles. Hominick, on the other side of things, 9 wins by knockout, 7 wins by submission, which a lot of people don't know. Now, it's his loss totals that are starting to creep up there, 3 by knockout and 5 by submission. Now, he hasn't been submitted in a long time, but his knockout losses to Chen Sung Jung, and the fact he got hurt several times against Aldo and dropped a couple times against Eddie Yagin certainly will be weighing on his mind. And the fact that he could be facing a 4-fight losing streak and potentially lose his position with the company if he lost here, I think that'll be weighing on his mind. And one thing, when you look at this, he is the superior striker, and he has fought a guy the size of Pablo Garza before in George Roop, and he was able to get inside, was able to land with power and strength on that taller opponent, and it carried well, and he knocked him out and scored the W. Garza will need to maintain distance, and some of the things I've seen with Garza, Jabouin used a lot of kicks, which Hominick does not, but he was still able to get inside and land with regularity and was doing very well until he got caught with that flying triangle. Additionally, when Dustin Poirier fought Garza, he did very well breaking down his guard with straight punches down the middle, had him backing up and covering up, and even Bermudez, big pressure, seems to be Pablo Garza's weak point. That's one thing Hominick does well, is he keeps moving forward. He has, like I said, wonderful combinations, very straight. He had a nice straight right that hurt Roop in that fight. He also caught him with a left hook I really like Hominick striking. I think he'll come out desperate in this fight, but he'll fight a smart fight. So my prediction is Mark Hominick to defeat Pablo Garza by knockout. Our second prediction of the evening is in the UFC's middleweight division as Canadian Nick the Promise Ring, 13-1-0, battles Constantinos Costa Philippou, 11-2-0 with 1 no contest. Both guys have put a decent run together in the UFC. Ring is coming off a controversial win over Court McGee, which pushed his UFC record to 3-1 overall. Plus, he had a fairly solid stint on The Ultimate Fighter until an injury forced him off of it. Costa Philippou, on the other hand, debuted with a loss to Nick Gatone, but has since picked up 4 straight wins, including picking up wins over Ricky Fukuda and Court McGee coming into this. And the reason I say that is both Costa Philippou and Nick Ring have faced Fukuda and McGee. Both of them are 2-0, so it's almost like the completion of a little mini tournament where both, 4 fighters were involved. These 2 guys are each 2-0. They're both going to face off, and I would say the winner of this will get a little push up the ladder. Now, looking at their win-loss totals, Costa Philippou, 14 fights overall, 5 wins by knockout, 5 wins by decision. His 2 losses have come by decision. On the other hand, Nick Ring, 14 wins as well, 2 wins by knockout, 6 by submission, 5 by decision. Now, the first thing I look at in this fight, as Nick Ring has been involved in some very controversial and close decision victories. In his debut against Ricky Fukuda, it was very close. A lot of people felt Fukuda won that fight, so much so that Dana White gave Fukuda his win bonus, even though Ring got the victory. Then in his last bout against Court McGee, again, another very interesting decision. If you look at the stat totals, McGee outlanded Ring 146-71, better than 2-1, and McGee was still given the, Ring was still given the victory. So that's something to keep in mind, that if this fight goes to decision, Nick Ring seems to have this ability to steal close fights somehow. Now, looking at what this fight comes down to, Costa Philippou is a fantastic boxer, and it's strictly boxing. I don't see him use hardly any kicks. He'll throw the odd one, but not a ton. He has excellent boxing, great footwork, good hands, great combinations, and he has big power. We saw him stop Jared Hammond impressively, and when Hammond was one of those guys that just seems like nobody could stop him, Philippou just dropped him. And another thing that Philippou has is that excellent takedown defense, 85% takedown defense. Over his last 3 fights, 3 different fighters have thrown a grand total of 17 takedowns his way. He has stopped all of them. In his UFC career, 27 takedowns have been attempted on him. All but 4 were defended, and 3 of those 4 came in his very first bout against Nick Gatone. So this guy's really developing a nice ground game, grappling defense, and the striking to complement it. And that's the thing, if you can't get him off his feet, as Ricky Fukuda in the last fight, it was very good takedowns, so he went 0 for 8. If you can't get Philippou off his feet, you have to deal with his boxing, and that's something I think Nick Ring's going to have issues with. Nick Ring does have a higher strikes landed percentage at 3.35 to 2.86 when compared to Philippou, but if you flip the table and look at the striking defense, Ring gets hit 3.62 times per minute compared to only 2.64 for Philippou. So if you chalk that up over a 15-minute bout, if this goes the distance, that's 55 strikes that Ring's going to absorb in a fight compared to 39 to Philippou. So that's a big differential. And considering I give Philippou an advantage in the combination and power facet, I think that's going to be big. Ring took a beating in the McGee fight. He got pounded with combinations. He did a nice job countering in his own right, but his face was bloody and battered. And I give Philippou a power edge over McGee in that sense. So I think when he lands on Ring, he's going to do damage and do a big thing. Another thing, we look at Ring over his career in the UFC. In his lone victory against Head, he went 5 for 5. James Head, he went 5 for 5 in takedowns, which is an impressive number. Flip the table. In his loss to Tim Boetsch, 0 for 2, and in his controversial losses or victories over Fukuda McGee, a combined 0 for 8 in takedowns. So in order for Ring to have a solid performance, he needs to land takedowns, and that's going to be difficult against Costa Philippou. What Ring does well is he counters well. He has a nice straight right that he'll stick into an opponent that rushes forward, but he doesn't throw combinations great, and he was getting beaten up and eaten up by those combinations from Court McGee, and I think that's an issue here because I think Philippou throws combinations better. Watch out, Philippou has a nice uppercut with power, and Ring was ducking his head a little bit against McGee and getting hit with those. Either way, I think Philippou has significantly better striking than Nick Ring. He'll need to be definitive and go out and get the job done and land, repetitively with his strikes and prove to the judges he has won this fight. But either way, I think Philippou will do a nice job cutting off the cage, not chasing Nick Ring like we saw Tim Boetsch do when he beat Ring. Stay right in front of him. So my prediction is Costa Philippou to defeat Nick Ring by decision. In our third matchup of the evening, we are in the middleweight division as Francis Limitless Carmont, 19-7-0, battles filthy Tom Lawlor, 8-4-0 with 1 no contest. Francis Carmont was coming to the UFC and lit the place on fire with 3 consecutive wins, including submission wins of Carlos Vamala and Magnus Siedenblad in his last 2 matchups. Tom Lawlor, on the other hand, coming off a victory over Jason McDonald, only took him 50 seconds to knock out the Canadian. Prior to that, he was submitted at UFC 139 by now rising in top contender Chris Weidman. Looking at their win-loss totals, Francis Carmont, He is a very well-rounded fighter. He has 6 wins by knockout and has excellent Muay Thai, but his big numbers, 10 wins by submission. The guy's really shown some good submission and good wrestling, and training with George St-Pierre and Faraz Zahabi and the rest of the guys over at TriStar. It's very, you can see where that comes from. Tom Lawlor, on the other hand, he's only fought 13 times in his career, which is, it's not a huge number. 3 wins by knockout, 3 wins by submission, 2 decision. Tom Lawler's filthy. He's a tough guy who gets in there. He's not afraid to slug it out. He'll go to the ground. He has some pretty good grappling numbers. You look at his numbers overall. Averages 3.48 takedowns per fight. 76 or 67% takedown defense, which is significant. His takedown accuracy numbers only 39%, which isn't the greatest. On the other side of things, Francis Carmont in his 3 fights, over 2.5 takedowns averaged per fight, 56% takedown accuracy, and a very impressive 92% defense for guys that want to take him down. And you look at something like Carlos Vemela, top-level Czech wrestling champion, so definitely somebody who has the ability to take guys down. Physically, big advantages for Carmont, 6'3" to Lawlor, 6 foot tall, and he'll also have a 4-inch reach advantage, which should help him out. Like I said, I really like Carmont's well-rounded ground game. He has very good Muay Thai. Against Chris Camozzi, he bullied him around and really showed some good clinch work in close. And Chris Camozzi is a very big middleweight, and Carmont had his way with him, throwing him around, slamming him, driving those knees, and really outworking him on the cage. That's something Tom Lawler's going to have to be very careful of. And one thing with Lawlor is he does have some conditioning issues. We've seen him fade in fights. And fighting a physical specimen like Francis Carmont, he'll need to be careful of that. Now, Carmont hasn't been perfect, despite being 3-0. In the Siedenblad fight, we saw him get mounted and in trouble. He was able to survive, remain calm, and get out of that. Carlos Vemela had a couple opportunities to lock in guillotine chokes, and again, Carmont did a nice job enduring and coming out in a better position as a result of, taking that risk. Tom Lawlor, he has had issues being submitted. He was doing very well with against Joe Dorkson before he kind of got tired, punched himself out. Dorkson came back and eventually set him up and submitted him in that fight. And, of course, we saw Chris Weidman put him to sleep with the Darce choke, which was very impressive. That's something he'll have to be very careful of because Francis Carmont has a great top game. He's very physical. He has some long limbs. He's able to control and maneuver opponents and eventually set up submissions, rear naked chokes. He did a wonderful job against Vemela, transferring from a rear-based crucifix into a rear naked choke and eventually putting him away. I really like what Carmont brings. He's come out of nowhere, really, in his fighting career and done a nice job at this level. I think this is another step in his direction. Tom Lawler's no easy out for anybody. He's got developing striking, and he certainly can handle himself on the ground, but I just think Francis Carmont has too many tools, so my prediction is Francis Carmont to defeat Tom Lawlor by submission. Our co-main event of the evening comes in the UFC's welterweight division, and at one point was considered a title eliminator. Not 100% sure how that goes now, especially with Anderson Silva allegedly going to challenge George St-Pierre. The winner of this fight could have to sit on the shelf for a while or take another match before they get their shot at the gold. Either way, it's Martin the Hitman Kampmann, 25-0, battling Johny Big Rig Hendricks, 13-1-0. Looking at what they've done recently, Martin Kampmann snapped a 2-fight losing streak with the win over Rick Story, has since piled on victories over Thiago Alves and Jake Ellenberger, 3 in a row, and finds himself on the verge of a title shot. Johny Hendricks, on the other hand, very impressive. Only one loss in his career, and that was against Rick Story. Since then, stopped TJ Wahlberger, split decision over Mike Pierce, stopped John Fitch with a KO only 12 seconds, and a split decision over Josh Koscheck to rocket up the standings. Physically, the way these guys match up, some advantages for Martin Kampmann. He's going to have a 3-inch reach advantage and a 3-inch height advantage, which should help him in maintaining distance against Johny Hendricks, and I'll talk about that in a second because that's going to be key in this fight. For Martin Kampmann. Win-loss totals, Kampmann is a Danish kickboxing champion. 8 of his wins have come by knockout, but a very underrated ground game. 7 wins by submission, multiple ones in the UFC. He is a brown belt in BJJ. And they talked about one of his last fights. He holds the record for the 3rd most submission attempts in the welterweight division, which is impressive, and a lot of people don't expect that from Kampmann, but he's a very well-rounded fighter. On the negative side, he has been knocked out 3 times, and we've seen him get hurt a couple times, so that's something to be aware of. Johny Hendricks, on the other hand, NCAA Division I wrestler, very good grappling, but he's developed his striking and his power. 7 wins by knockout, debuted in the UFC with a knockout win over Amir Sadallah, TKO victory over Charlie Brenneman, as I said, TJ Wahlberger, and that blasting shot at UFC 144 over John Fitch. All impressive. 5 wins by decision, his lone loss coming by decision against Rick Story. It was a very close fight. Now, one thing with Hendricks, he's a very good wrestler, but he's been working on his wrestling, and he self-admittedly said, I don't practice wrestling as much, my wrestling as much because I was so good at it. His focus now is on striking. And I think that's starting to show up in his in-ring performance. When he debuted against Ricardo Funch, he landed 7 takedowns, he landed 8 against TJ Grant, But then later on in his career against Mike Pierce, 1 for 6 in the takedowns, 2 for 6 against Josh Koscheck. And I think this is the type of fight where he needs to rely on his wrestling. But easier said than done. Martin Kampmann, 78% takedown defense, very good, very technical takedown defense. The guy who had the most success against him in recent memory, Jake Shields, who went 4 for 15 overall. But look at these other numbers. Paul Tiago, 1 for 9 in takedown attempts. Diego Sanchez, 1 for 15. So Martin Kampmann, very good at defending those takedowns. Good hips, good balance, good sprawls, good counters when people go for takedowns. And he will also shoot a knee in, which is something that Hendricks will need to be very careful of. On the feet, the edge goes to Martin Kampmann. Technically speaking, he's one of the best strikers in the division in the UFC, as far as I'm concerned. He throws everything with technical precision, no wasted movement, and he counters. It's a beautiful counter right that we saw him drop Diego Sanchez, which was very impressive. He keeps things tight, nice kicks, and he has a really nice combination that a lot of fighters aren't expecting. He'll throw a punch and immediately move into range, grab the tie plum, and look for a knee strike, and then back out if he didn't do the damage or if he just wants to land that single shot. And fighters aren't expecting that, and that's something very effective. Kampmann does a nice job of moving laterally, using that distance, and that's where he needs to fight this fight. Johny Hendricks, on the other hand, he has big power, but he's going to have a reach deficit, and he doesn't have the technical striking skills to keep up with Martin Kampmann. He's developing, he's working, but he does not want to go toe-to-toe in a striking battle. He needs to brawl the boxer in this sense. He does have a nice lead uppercut, hook connection, and he has power and he stopped guys before. But one thing he does a lot of, he has a tendency to come up short, and with that reach deficit he has to deal with in this fight, I expect him to throw some punches and not land. And that's going to be an issue, because when you're throwing and not landing, a guy like Martin Kampmann is going to be able to stick counters in and circle away, and you're going to miss, and you're going to get teed off on in that sense, and that's something he needs to be very careful of. Now, Martin Kampmann has had issues in the past where he will get drawn into brawls. We saw it happen against Paul Daly, against Diego Sanchez a little bit. And when he gets caught on the wall, another example was against Jake Ellenberger and Rick Story. He gets caught on the wall, guys brawl with him, they start landing punches, he gets overwhelmed, and he can have issues. And that's what Johny Hendricks needs to do. Cut off the cage, back him up, land big shots, and that's something that I expect Johny Hendricks to look for in this fight. The big thing I'm looking at here is Hendricks has never faced a striker like Martin Kampmann. He's faced a myriad of wrestlers, looking at Koscheck, Fitch, Pierce, Story, Brenneman, and the list goes on and on. The last time he faced anybody that has some Thai boxing skills was way back in the day at UFC 113 against TJ Grant, who had been just developing his Thai boxing, and Grant lit him up with kicks and strikes and forced Hendricks to go for those takedowns and control him in that sense. And that's what I'm looking for here. I think Martin Kampmann is going to have a speed advantage, the reach advantage, the technical skill advantage. All he needs to do is avoid the takedowns, which he does a nice job of, and avoid those big strikes. And I think he's going to, and I think he'll do enough to win this fight. It's going to be close, but my prediction is Martin Kampmann to defeat Johny Hendricks by decision. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our main event prediction, as the long-reigning UFC welterweight champion George "Rush" St-Pierre, 22-2-0, goes head-to-head with the interim welterweight champion and former WEC welterweight champion, the natural-born killer Carlos Condit, 28-5-0. Now, George has been on the shelf for 18 months, and he's coming off a couple of injuries. There will certainly be ring rust there that he'll need to shake off pretty quickly, and we'll have to see how his in-ring performance is impacted by these injuries. His camp saying he's better than ever, but that's their job to say that. We will have to wait and see if that is actually the truth. Looking at what they've done recently, George St-Pierre, he's on a roll. The last time we saw him was April 30th, 2011, a decision victory over Jake Shields, and he's beaten some of the best in the world. Carlos Condit, a pretty stellar run of his own. He debuted in the UFC with a split decision loss to Martin Kampmann. Since then, he's beaten Jake Ellenberger, Rory McDonald, Dan Hardy, Dong Young Kim, and then UFC 143, he had a decision victory over Nick Diaz to capture the interim title. And that's pretty impressive. Now, both guys come out of Jackson's camp. George, of course, starting to spend more and more time at TriStar in Montreal, where he eventually, I think, will transition fully, with the exception of, some basic interactions with Jackson. But interestingly enough, Greg Jackson will not be cornering either man, obviously, and you would think he'd corner Carlos Condit, but he's not going to be. He's going to step away from this fight. And if I'm Carlos Condit, I feel a little bit slighted by that, considering he's a full-time Jackson Winklejohn fighter, George St-Pierre only part-time, and yet here's Jackson letting Carlos Condit go it on his own, or at least not going to be in his corner for that evening. Now, looking at their win-loss totals, Carlos Condit as well-rounded as you can get. He's a BJJ brown belt, 13 wins by submission, and he's very good on the ground. We saw what he's capable of. But more importantly, 13 wins by knockout. He stopped Rory McDonald with a come-from-behind TKO victory. We saw him knock out Dan Hardy with a vicious shot. We saw him hit that flying knee and punches to take out Dong Young Kim, the first guy to stop Kim. Very impressive in his ability to do that. George St-Pierre, on the other hand, The guy's got more black belts than he does weights. I'm not going to go into it, but he's a highly decorated athlete and very well versed in multiple fighting styles. Now, taking a look at his win-loss totals, 8 wins by knockout, 5 wins by submission, but the big numbers, the 9 wins by decision. He is a guy who's been accused of being a point fighter, a little conservative. You got to go back quite a ways before he actually picked up a decision. Shields, Koscheck, Hardy, and Alves. UFC 94 was the last time he stopped someone, and that was BJ Penn, who did not answer the bell after the 4th round. He TKO'd Matt Serra, submitted Matt Hughes. He is capable of finishing fighters, and he has made the statement he's going to go after it. He's going to go back to that killer instinct that we saw when he smoked Jay Heron and knocked him out, and that made him a fan-friendly fighter. He's going to go back to that style. Well, that's yet to be seen, because Carlos Condit, as his name would imply, he is a killer. And one thing, you look at George St-Pierre, both these guys are very well decorated. George St-Pierre, no wrestling background coming into the sport, has become one of the best wrestlers out there. Look at some stats first with George St-Pierre with his ground game. He averages 4.3 takedowns per fight, 78% takedown accuracy, 86% takedown defense. The guy is difficult to get off his feet and difficult to keep off of you. Carlos Condit, on the other hand, he averages less than a takedown per fight, 58% takedown accuracy when he does, 46% takedown defense. So he's the type of guy who's not going to shoot for takedowns on the level George St-Pierre is. But what I want to look at here is the thing. St-Pierre is a very smart fighter, and GSP likes to fight guys where they are weakest. Jake Shields is a very good ground fighter, so George kept it fighting, used the odd takedown, kept it standing, used the odd takedown, but kept it in Jake Shields' weakest point. Dan Hardy, pretty good striker. George St-Pierre takes him down. Thiago Alves, good striker. George St-Pierre takes him down. Now, he's not afraid to go after a fighter in his strong suits. That's, we saw him against John Fitch, had a number of takedowns. Same thing with Josh Koscheck. He was more than willing to take him down. But the big question I look at here is, where do you fight Carlos Condit where he is the weakest? He's a fantastic striker, and he's very good off his back. Excellent sweeps. He does a nice job of neutralizing an opponent's top game. We saw in his come-from-behind win over Rory McDonald that even though Rory was able to take him down several times, Condit was attacking off his back, and Rory had limited offense despite getting multiple top position situations. Condit was able to defend and eventually neutralize and get back to his feet, and that's very interesting as far as this fight is concerned. Physically, when you look at these two fighters, Condit has a 3-inch height advantage, but it's actually George is going to have a 2-inch reach advantage, so I'll be interested to see how that works out. I really think George is going to use his jab to try and keep Carlos out of range. We saw Nick Diaz use those straight punches to try and back Carlos up against the cage, and Carlos did a nice job of circling and attacking. But the fact that George he's going to be he's faster than Nick Diaz, and he should be more explosive. I expect he's going to be able to close the distance faster and work on Condit with his striking. And then I fully expect George to change levels. When he does, he'll have to be very careful with Carlos Condit's knees. But I think George is going to change levels and look to shoot takedowns. That's one area Carlos Condit has had issues with. He got taken down 3 times by Rory McDonald, 3 times by Jake Ellenberger, 5 times by Martin Kampmann. He has had problems with keeping the fights vertical, and while he is good off his back, George has fantastic top control. He has excellent takedowns, and I think that's what this fight is going to come down to. If George has lost some of his explosiveness, that could be an issue, but I like what George brings with his grappling game. His striking game is diverse. He's going to use a lot of kicks, and while Condit has big power as well, I really like George's speed to play a big factor, his athleticism. I think he's going to be able to smother Carlos Condit. Condit's a tough guy to put away. He has been submitted on 3 occasions. I don't think George is going to be able to submit him. Despite George's claims that he's going to go after things and be more aggressive, I think he will look to make sure to get back in the flow of things and get back to the point where he feels comfortable. He has to be careful of Carlos Condit's power. Condit has beautiful kicks, jumping knees he likes to throw, big-time power in his hands, and we know he's been stopped, or George has been stopped by Matt Serra. That's something you have to be careful of. But either way, I still think George St-Pierre is the heap, the top of the heap, the king of the division. And until someone proves otherwise, and the 18 months is certainly a concern, but I think George St-Pierre has the tools to beat Carlos Condit. So my prediction is George St-Pierre to defeat Carlos Condit by decision. So those are my predictions for UFC 154, St-Pierre versus Condit. Now there will be 8 preliminary predictions available on my website, and the way I work that is I get a prediction done, I post it. So please go over, check them out, and throughout fight week you'll see them all. Eventually they'll all be up. My bet pack's $10 will be available. I'll be giving out prize to one of the first people who purchase my bet pack. Check out the details on the website for that. $10, you get all of my breakdowns of the fights, and I'll talk about some guys. Are there certain fighters in this card that I didn't pick to win the fight, but because of value, they're worth picking. So make sure you check that out. Also, there'll be other predictions from other predictors available at kamikazeoverdrive.net. Thank you very much to all of my sponsors. I greatly appreciate it. We've got some good UFC coming up and good MMA coming up as we head towards the end of the year. And of course, very exciting. Unfortunately, the end of Strikeforce is almost upon us. One more show in January, and then we'll see who gets to come over, including the women's division, who heads over to the UFC, and some very interesting matchups as a result. Either way, Kamikaze Overdrive MMA Predictions. As always, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you right back here next time.